Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 10, beginning at verse 1. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you and ask for your blessing over our study, that you would help us to have a greater understanding of your word, that we might continue to grow in faith, and especially to celebrate the blessings of the coming of the Messiah that Daniel saw, and that we enjoy the blessings and the benefits of being in his kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. So I don't have a sheet for Daniel 10 yet. I'll have to finish that next week. I had a lot of other things. And so this last section, the last couple of chapters of Daniel, they all fit into his final vision, right? So we're in chapters 10, 11, and 12. And this consists of a single final vision. So I'll finish up some introductory stuff that I'll hand out next week. But we can still dive into it. And, this comes on the heels of the previous chapter where he talked about the coming of the destruction of, or at least the desecration of the temple. And we talked about the 70 weeks. And, one of the difficulties about that is because the word week means 7 in Hebrew. So is he talking about 77s? And some people want to try to create just multiply those, and then you get 490. But then there's no 490-year period from any of the events that happened during the time of Daniel and to the coming of Jesus, right? It kind of falls short. And so critical scholars try to say, well, look, if you go exactly 490 years from, whichever date, because, is it the date from when Nehemiah decides to go to Jerusalem, or when they finally start building, or when the temple is rededicated? Those are all different dates in that period of time. And then you go 490 years ahead, then it doesn't come to the time of Jesus. And so because of that shortfall, critical scholars say, see, that's proof that Daniel was in error, because he can't tell the future. See, that's how they do it.
There's a book called The Coming Prince by this English guy. He's a crusty old guy. And he went into it in detail, and he found ways to, with a basis for adjusting the timeline based on the Jewish calendar,
right,
different events, and so he made it. He worked through this. It's I can't remember all the details, but anyway, he worked through it and got very close to the 490 years, and so it's not so far fetched. And the things he
it's not necessarily. Yeah, it's not necessarily. It's not. We're not saying it's far fetched, but one of the things, inside my studies, recognizing how does Daniel use the words, and not necessarily trying to imply a meaning to it that's not in the text of Daniel. So one of the reasons behind trying to call the 490 years, or taking the 70 and then the number 7, or the word for week, and multiplying those, some people take that from the book of Leviticus, because in Leviticus it talks about the 49 years of before, and then on the 5th, the year after the 7 sevens, you're supposed to have the year of Jubilee. And so they're taking that text and using that to apply it here to come up with the 490 years. But it's probably more likely that the way that, remember when we saw the section where it told us that Nebuchadnezzar was, that he was being purified under this, where he had that, he kind of had like a period where he went crazy, right? And it tells us it was a period of 7 times, right? And I think that's what the thing was. But it uses the word times, right? And so does that mean years? And it meant the perfect amount of time that God was going to purify him. And that happened over like a 3.5-year period, historically, right? And so a lot of the authors will say that from the way that Daniel uses time stamps is that he's using it in a way that refers to God's working in the lives of the people, and that if we try to impose some type of exact answer. See, the thing is that the historical critical people say, they say Daniel meant to be exact, and because he wasn't, it's proof that he's wrong. And then the other evangelicals say, no, Daniel, we got to take it literally, and so we're going to come up with, we just don't know the right dates, and if we can find the date, then we can say, it adds up to this period of time. And I think that we need to look at it from the perspective of he knows that God's revealing to him the coming of the Messiah, so it is pointing to the time of Jesus. And so here's kind of inside one of my commentaries, let me read to you the events predicted by Gabriel that are pointed ahead in the section. So for instance, the first 7 weeks that was listed in chapter 9:25 points to the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Okay, and that happened. That started in 538, and then they finally finished it in 445. Okay, and so using that 7 weeks as like the perfect amount of time that God intended. So we're using them symbolically. The number 7 often is used for perfection. So it's the perfect time that God intended for them to rebuild the temple. And then it mentioned in chapter 9, verse 25, it also mentioned the 62 weeks. It says 62 weeks when it will again have been built with a plaza and a moat, right? So it's talking about the temple area. So what is that referring to? So did Jerusalem ever have a moat around it? No. But it's talking about the defenses that God is going to use. And so God is building up his people and protecting them. And so this one scholar, the book that I'm using is by Andrew Steinman, who's one of my Hebrew professors in seminary. He says that represents the time from Nehemiah to Jesus, right? So because Nehemiah is the one who went back to rebuild, but when he went to rebuild, he didn't start with the temple. He started with the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So if you're going to try to come up with an exact date, it was at the date that the walls were started. Was it the date that the temple was started? Was the date when the temple was dedicated? And we can't really figure out which date that is. So he says that we take this as that period. The 62 weeks is the time that God was building up and preparing his people. So that does add up to the time from Nehemiah to the time of Jesus. But if you're going to try to come up with an exact number of years, it doesn't necessarily work. So the time of Nehemiah is approximately 445, and then of course the coming of Jesus is, some scholars say that he was born in 3 BC, and then this author says 2 BC is the date that he's going with. And the only reason that Jesus was born 2 years before the birth of Christ was because the dating that we use today was miscalculated in the Middle Ages, and then it had been used already for so long that by the time they found the error, they couldn't go back and just change everything. So, and it had to do with miscalculating the number of years of some of the Roman rulers or something. So, even from the very beginning, like within like a 50-year period of the Julian calendar and the calendar that we use today, they already knew that it was off, but they just kept using it anyways. So Jesus would have been born, some people say 2 or 3 BC. Some people say as late as 4 BC. But still that makes sense if we talk about, because there was never a moat around Jerusalem, but it talks about God's defending his people and preparing. Because what does Jerusalem stand for? What was the most important thing in Jerusalem? The temple. And when Jesus says in John chapter 2, tear down this temple, in 3 days I will rebuild it. And his disciples didn't understand what he was saying. And it says they absolutely didn't understand because they said, "Oh, it took 40 years to build this. How can you build it in 3 days?" And it says the temple he was talking about was his body, right? So the temple in the Old Testament represented the presence of God on earth, but Jesus is literally the presence of God on earth. So in essence, Jesus is the temple, and that's what he was talking about. So this is what this would be kind of like a typological description. And last week I gave you that sheet that talked about there's the traditional view and the typological view. And so the traditional view is kind of trying to fit it into more of a timeline, but this typological view, it also works. It's not like it's completely different. And so then the troubled time that's mentioned in verse 25 that we looked at a couple weeks ago would represent the time, the Hellenistic era. That's when the Greeks were ruling. And what was that era? Well, what happened? Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, that was like 167 to 164 BC. He's the one who desecrated the temple. And so Daniel's talking about that. But if that's the date that was the end of this prophecy, then that doesn't work because it's pointing ahead to something else. For instance, in verse 26, chapter 9:26 of Daniel, it says, "The city and the holy place will be destroyed with a leader who is coming, the risen Messiah who will return." So that wasn't when the Greeks ruled. In fact, the Greeks actually didn't destroy the temple; they just desecrated the temple. So who destroyed the temple?
The Romans.
That's right, the Romans. So then that's talking about the prophecy that didn't occur until Titus destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, right? So that's where he puts that, and then and so the verse that says the Messiah will be cut off after the 69th week during the 70th week. That's in verse 26. That refers to the crucifixion of Jesus. So you kind of have this, the whole picture is like preparing for the coming of Jesus. Then Jesus comes and is cut off, and then the holy city is destroyed, and that happens in 70 AD. So those are the basics of chapter 9, and then chapter 10. It's interesting because it's not chronological, because now this one is almost like a vision that happened before this other vision. Any questions about that? I mean, that was just kind of a basic overview of what we looked at last week. And I gave you the little sheet that showed the two different ways of looking at it. The traditional view, which is traditional Christians for the last 2,000 years have understood it that basic way, and then the typological view is sometimes looking at it with more symbolically. And the Old Testament often gives us symbolic prophecies. For instance, the Exodus, right? I mean, God didn't just take the people out of Egypt in order to free them, but to use that as a metaphor for how he is going to send the second Moses, who is Jesus, who leads us out of slavery to sin into the promised land of heaven. Right? So that's the typology, right? And so if those typologies are all throughout the Old Testament, then certainly Daniel's vision could fit into a typology as well. So the 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and then the final week, right? And so they represent the time before where the temple is being rebuilt, and then the time between Nehemiah and the coming of Jesus, and then that final week would represent either the final week of Jesus' life, which is, I think that's the traditional view, or it could represent the period of time during the church era, which we're still living in. That would be the typological view. And that's the thing that we're not absolutely sure, because if we're living in the time of the last days, in that final week, then does the destruction of Jerusalem represent the end of the world, or did it already take place, as the traditional view says, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem? Because there are things in the text that seem like it could not have been fulfilled yet, right? So, and especially when we get to chapter 10 through 12, these are things that a lot of the prophecies have not actually come to fruition yet, and not completely. So, we kind of live in this tension of the now, not yet, and we see fulfillments that have happened in the lives of God's people, but there may be more fulfillment in the future. So it's kind of like a double fulfillment. For instance, the prophecy of the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and he shall be called Emanuel. Isaiah chapter 7:14. Now, the rest of that text says, Isaiah is telling Ahaz the king, he's saying, by the time this child is born, before the two kings you're afraid of, which is Syria and Israel, to the north of him, will no longer exist, because the Assyrians are going to destroy them. Well, if that prophecy if it only referred to Jesus, then it never happened, because then Ahaz would never have been able to see it fulfilled. So in his lifetime, he actually did see a virgin conceive, gave birth, and then within the 13 years of that child's life, the two kings were destroyed. The way we understand it, though, is that the word for virgin, alma, can mean young woman. It means a young woman who's unmarried, right? And so it's not saying that the young woman who's unmarried isn't going to get married. It simply says that the current time that the prophecy was given, that this one of the daughters of the king, or maybe somebody in his family, like maybe his granddaughter or something like that, was unmarried, was a virgin, and then she was going to soon give birth. So technically, within the time of the prophecy and the time that she gave birth, she got married, and then she had a child. So there was no miracle in the virgin birth there, but because of the way it's worded, it does apply to the ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. That's why it's quoted in the New Testament and says this is what the prophet was talking about when he said the virgin will conceive. So, because in Deuteronomy 18 it says that God told the people, if a prophet tells you something and it doesn't happen, then he's a false prophet. So there had to be things that had happened in the lifetime of the people. Otherwise they wouldn't have any reason to listen to these prophets. So Isaiah was telling him something that happened in the lifetime of Ahaz. Ahaz actually did see one of his young daughters who was unmarried get married, have a child, and then within 13 years, these two kings were destroyed by the Syrians, and he didn't have to worry about them. But then what he had to worry about was the Assyrians, because then it was like inviting making a pact with the devil, right? When the nose of the camel comes in the tent, the whole camel's in the tent. So this is what happened with Ahaz. He made a deal with the king of Assyria, and it backfired on him. But the prophecy was something he could see in his own lifetime. And that was reason for him to have listened to the rest of Isaiah's words. But in the New Testament, we see the apostles are using what the Old Testament prophets said to show the ultimate fulfillment. So that's why we call it a typology. So the typology is like it's pointing to something greater than itself. And this isn't just my interpretation. It's not just some person in the church's interpretation. This is actually the Bible's interpretation. Read the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is the letter in the New Testament that actually outlines the majority of all of the typologies that the Old Testament was pointing to. For instance, it talks about Melchizedek. Well, who is Melchizedek? Well, he's mentioned in like 3 or 4 verses in the book of Genesis, chapter 14 or something like that. I mean, if you were reading the Bible, I would not blame you for skipping over it and never remembering it. And then in the book of Hebrews, he says, Jesus is like Melchizedek, because Melchizedek is Hebrew for my king is righteous. And he says, look, Jesus is our righteous king. And then he's the king of Salem. And the word Salem means peace. And he says, look, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. He's a royal, fulfills that prophecy. And then this guy was a high priest, but he wasn't in the line of Aaron. And so Jesus couldn't be a high priest if he was in the line of Aaron, because he was born from the line of Judah and the line of David. So he's either royal or he's a priest, right? So how could Jesus be both? Because he had to be both. He had to be a prophet, a priest, and a king. So he was a prophet in the line of Moses, because he was greater than Moses, and that's what Hebrews tells us. He was a priest in the line of Melchizedek, not in the line of Aaron, because Melchizedek had no beginning and no end. And so it tells us that just as Jesus has no beginning and no end, he's eternal. So the prophecies in the Old Testament often have that further fulfilled meaning, which is called typological, and it's pointing ahead. Like it's called foreshadowing, or it's helping us to see the fuller understanding of God's plan of salvation. And so that's why I think that it's helpful to use that when we talk about Daniel, because then we can see that the 77s don't have to be literal years for them to be symbolic of what God is doing. So God prepared his people, bringing them back home, just like he promised. 70 years later, they came back to Jerusalem. And then the time after they rebuilt to the time of Jesus fits into that 62 weeks. And then the final week is pointing to how Jesus is ushering in this new kingdom, the kingdom of God's destroying sin, death, and the devil. Okay, so let's see if I gotta find the sheet real quick. Okay, so yeah, the 70 weeks of Daniel from Daniel 9:24 through 27, the traditional Messianic view, it represents the final week of Jesus' life, right? So it talks about, or the final week represents Jesus' life, right? So, it talks about
Well, the final week goes beyond.
yeah, well, that's true. Okay, so it goes from the time that Jesus is born until Hadrian conquers Jerusalem in 135. And then the typological view just kind of lumps everything together in the age of the church. So the Antichrist almost destroys the church, so it's kind of like we would be living in the final week. After Jesus came, it's like a new era, right? And so we're living in that new era after he conquered sin, death, and the devil, but he hasn't returned to take us home yet. So in the meantime, there's going to be trouble, and the trouble is the Antichrist, right? And so there's lots of passages in the New Testament that remind us, like Titus and Timothy talk about the Antichrist, and John, I think 2nd and 3rd John talk about the Antichrist. And so I think in Thessalonians or Timothy, it talks about the man of lawlessness, right? But it's similar. Some people think it's the same idea. And so it's this coming of this Antichrist who's going to try to destroy the church, but he's going to fail. But in the meantime, there'll be lots of persecution.
From Concordia, there seems to be a lot of, like in the Middle Ages, Luther and his compatriots refer to the Catholic Church and the Pope in particular as the Antichrist.
Right. Well, if you read in 2nd John, it actually says, for there are many antichrists that have come. And so to say that the Antichrist is a single person, there's passages that...
It's all the popes.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So then in all ages, there are going to be people who are... Because the word Antichrist in Greek simply means against Christ. So anybody who's against Christ, I mean, gosh, you just look around you. There's lots of atheistic rulers. I mean, even in France. I mean, France is an atheistic country, and they're going to hell in a handbasket right now. I don't know if you consider them the Antichrist, but you got like the ruler of North Korea who wants to destroy, South Korea and throwing everything into a tizzy right now. Then you got all the different like Hezbollah and other groups that are trying to destroy not only the Jewish state, but also Christians as well. So those are all antichrists. But then, the way that he's very specific in the end of Daniel chapter 9 helps us to see that he is talking about the time period when Antiochus IV desecrated the temple. Chapter 9, verse 27, or 20... Yeah, 27. He will confirm a covenant with many on 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifices and offering, and on the wing of a temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. This verse, the last verse of chapter 9, is full of difficulties because how you interpret the words, because like, for instance, I think in a lot of Bibles it'll have the word, it says on a wing, and then it'll have little brackets and it says of the temple, because that phrase is not found in all the documents. So they're trying to make sense of it. What is the wing? On the wing he's going to set up an abomination. Are they talking about a wing of the temple? Are they talking about another building? Is it talking about a bird? We don't know specifically, but I think the context...
ESV says on the wing of abominations shall come one. So that almost sounds like a flying bee.
Yeah. So just the wording itself is difficult to understand. So I think that we can, from the book of Daniel, helping us to see that the way he uses time is in order to symbolize the events that God is unfolding before us. And so that helps us as we move into this last section, because chapters 10 through 12 are going to be super difficult because a lot of these things haven't come true yet. We don't know what they are, right? So some people are trying to interpret them to say, there's going to be a battle between an army from the north and from the south, and who are those kingdoms? And I've heard commentators over and other scholars for the last 30 years of my theological studies say that, oh, maybe that's China. And so, they used to say it was Russia, but now that Russia is not quite as strong and it's kind of disintegrating, maybe it's just China. They're the million-man army that's going to cross the border and wipe out India or something like that. Who knows?
You ever hear Michelle Bachmann, who used to be a congresswoman, I think, from Minnesota? She talks all about the end times right now.
Yeah. Well, but every generation has done that. So I try to avoid that. I'd say, sure, it might look super clear, like this is exactly what it's talking about, and maybe that is. But maybe it's just one of the many indications. Because Jesus says in Matthew 24 and 25, he says that the end, when you see wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and famines, he says this is just the beginning of birth pains. So it's the beginning of the end. So definitely we're in the beginning of the end. We're not necessarily in the end yet, though. That's why I'm
in the end for years.
That's right. Well, yeah, because a 1,000 years is like a day. 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord. So we've been in the end for a long time. And the only thing you can positively say is that we're one day closer to the end of the world than we were yesterday. That's the only thing we can say for sure.
A couple of years ago, and I'm not sure how they counted, but they took Kissinger and gave numbers to his letters, and they ended up 666. So see, Kissinger's the Antichrist.
Yeah, see, people are very creative, and they can do that. We're not even sure. Like some people say that that Nero is the Antichrist because the Greek letters of his name, because in Greek the letters actually are used for both letters and for numbers. So if you take up the numeric value of his name, it does add up to 666. So is he the Antichrist, or is it somebody else? People will try to come up with all kinds of stuff. But let's try to read through chapter 10. Okay, someone read the first verse there.
In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a word was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict, and he understood the word and had understanding of the vision.
Okay.
This is back into the 3rd year of Cyrus.
Right. So, so going back to the 3rd year, we know that Cyrus conquered Babylon, and from the way that we've been interpreting this is I believe that Darius and Daniel are the same person, and so that Darius and Cyrus. Okay, Darius and Cyrus, right? And
so the Darius is mentioned at the beginning of 9 is the same person as Cyrus at the beginning of 10.
Yeah, and we talked about that because it makes sense that because there's a verse that says Darius, that is Cyrus. There's a verse that can be understood to say that, and that was earlier on that we talked about that. So, but anyways, Cyrus, Darius conquered Babylon, and so Cyrus is being named here as the one who in his 3rd year, the 3rd year of that conquest of Babylon was 539. So 3 years into his reign would be 536. So, in fact, in verse 4 of this chapter, he actually gives us a more specific time period. Like it says, on the 24th day of the 1st month, I was standing on the bank of the great river Tigris. So, that's not difficult to identify. That actually is April 23rd, 536 BC, right? So that's what scholars have determined the date of this vision, which means that this vision took place just a couple of weeks before the work began to rebuild the temple. And that's what it tells us in Ezra 3, verse 8. So turn to Ezra real quick.
3:8?
Yeah, 3:8.
3:8, not 30.
Okay, so it says, in the 2nd month of the 2nd year, after the arrival at the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of the brothers and the priests and the Levites and all who had returned from the captivity to Jerusalem began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building of the house of the Lord. Okay, so that tells us when it took place, and so that date is just a couple weeks after the date that Daniel is telling us his vision is. So God was revealing to him that he's going to see this vision of a man, and that God's going to fulfill his promise to end the exile, and the rebuilding of Jerusalem was going to happen. So it happened just before that actually did happen. And remember his name, he was given the name Belteshazzar by the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. That was way back in chapter 1. Okay, and it tells us that the message is true, and it concerns a great war, right? Is that, not every translation uses that phrase. What do you guys have for the second half of verse 1?
It says a great conflict.
Okay, because it could also mean a
says,
burden.
And it was about a great conflict. That's it.
Okay, so let me see here. And so the war that is coming in, that he is understanding, is pointing to the conflicts that are going to happen under the how God's people are going to be attacked. So that could refer typologically to all the people in the future. So we got the Greeks. Antiochus is going to have a war against Judaism. He's going to try to destroy, at least desecrate the temple. The Romans literally destroy the temple, so that's a war. But then if you look even further into the future, there's the battle against Jesus, right? I mean, he's arrested in the garden, and then remember he's taken before Pilate, and then Pilate says, let's see, remember Jesus said he could call a legion of angels if he wanted to. Was that in the Garden of Gethsemane?
That was the group.
Yeah, so he says that. And so, because he's saying, am I fighting a battle? If I wanted to, I could call, a legion of angels. But so there is a battle against him, but he doesn't fight back. And that's actually the fulfillment of Isaiah 53. And then you can also say, then when Nero was killing the Christians, that was another battle against God's people. And then, that happened all the way up till the time of Constantine, right? So, like in the late 200s, there was some other Roman emperors that hated the Christians and were trying to, execute them, and taking them to the Colosseum to be killed by wild animals. And then, Constantine, of course, ended that in 325 when he became the emperor and became a Christian. But from that point on, Christianity may have enjoyed power and influence in the world through the Middle Ages, but that the attack against Christianity continued, and even in the Middle Ages with the rise of the Muslim faith. Not because the Muslim faith was necessarily trying to compete with Christianity, but because they were trying to convert people at the point of a sword, right? Convert or die is what they did as they conquered all of North Africa, all of the East, right? All the area of Babylon was originally, it had a lot of Jewish people there and a lot of Semitic people, right? So all the descendants of the Persian Empire were there. Well, all of a sudden in the 6th century AD, the Muslims took over and killed everybody who wouldn't convert, and all those areas now, since 600 AD, have all become Muslim. So that of course is a huge attack on God's people. And even to this day, if you are a Christian in a Muslim country, you're not going to be having a very good time. You would be jailed, you could be killed, and so. But I've read that there are becoming more and more conversions in some of these Muslim countries because people are having visions and dreams of Jesus appearing to them and converting them, bringing them to faith. So, when it talks about this war, to try to identify specifically which one it's talking about, we'll go on a little further and see what else it says. Verse 2.
In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning for 3 weeks. I'll keep going. I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, that is Tigris, I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a man clothed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist.
Okay, so similarly to the way that God's people prepared themselves in order to be in covenant with the Lord, Daniel is fasting, similar to what he did in chapter 1 when they were being forced to eat the food of the king, and then they weren't technically fasting because they were eating vegetables and water, but in essence that was fasting from the delicacies. So here it says the same thing, and this is a common practice of God's people to, in order to come before the Lord, you have to. That's what we do during the season of Lent, right? As we prepare for the celebration of Easter, we have a time where we fast. And so the fasting, I think is less popular than it used to be. There used to be more Christian imposed fasting. Even the Catholic Church imposed a fast of no meat on Fridays, and representation of how Jesus gave up his own body dying on the cross. So, throughout the Middle Ages, people fasted from eating meat on Fridays, and then the church continued to do that even till today. A lot of people don't understand why. And we live in an age of abundance, so it's a lot easier to fast when you don't have anything to eat than it is to fast when you have abundance. At least in our country and our culture. Obviously, there are people around the world who don't have the same type of options as we do.
What does it mean where it says, nor did he anoint himself?
He didn't bathe for 3 weeks.
No, it doesn't mean that he didn't bathe. He could just use water. So, one of the things that in a desert climate, in order to clean yourself, so they didn't use soap that much,
No, they
right?
used olive oil.
So they would use olive oil. So what you do is you take olive oil and you smooth it on your skin, and you take it's not like a knife, but it's like a flat object. It could be made of wood, it could be made of metal, but it wouldn't have a sharp end, and you'd scrape. And by scraping your skin, like a squeegee, what it does is the oil will take the dirt and the body odor off of you, but it won't dry you, right? So in the desert, you don't want to use soap because, it's already dry enough and it'll actually hurt your skin. So, we don't do that today. We don't wash ourselves with oil, but in the ancient world, that's what they did. They anointed their heads with oil, and then you'd, clean it off, and then you would be fresh and you'd be clean, be kind of oily, but it was better to be oily than to be dry or dirty.
They didn't have psoriasis.
What was that?
They didn't have psoriasis.
Yeah, they probably didn't because they used oil, right? Olive oil. And olive oil is really healthy for all kinds of things. Not just, we don't usually use it for our skin, but, it's good for, for eating. It's good for lighting candles. It's almost like a universally used thing in the ancient world. They used it for all kinds of stuff, for cooking, for eating, for lights, for cleaning themselves. It's amazing. Okay, so this has to do with his preparation, and then verse 4 was the 24th day of the first month, which we said happened in the spring of 536 BC, and he's standing on the Tigris River, so he's still in the city of Babylon, but it's at this point it's already under the control of the Persians. So again, this is not chronological because this goes back to what happened earlier when Darius came into the city and took over back in, was that chapter 7 or 6? And so the man that he sees, right? Who is this man that he sees dressed in a linen? What kind of a person might this be?
Jesus.
Okay, well, it could be Jesus, but it doesn't. Okay, because remember in chapter 7 we saw that one like a son of man was, he looked like, his body looked like glowing bronze, and that he was coming in glory. And so that we usually describe as Jesus, because it does say he was given all authority and he would have an everlasting kingdom, and then people worshipped him too. But here it doesn't say anything about being worshipped. So maybe this is an angel. And so, the linen may refer to him being a priest, and then having a sash of fine gold around his waist. I don't think that the priests in the Old Testament wore gold sashes. They just wore the linen, and the high priest would wear an ephod, which has 12 semi-precious stones on it. So it sounds kind of like a priest, but it's most likely just a divine being. So I think it's just an angel. Okay, verse 6, his body was like chrysolite, and his face was like lightning, his eyes flamed like a torch, his arms and legs gleamed like burnished bronze, and his voice sounded like a multitude. Now, the description here is similar to some of the places elsewhere in the Bible. For instance, if we look at, let's see, that would be in like Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 7.
The streets, the feet were like,
Oh, I'm sorry.
the feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze.
Yeah, so the divine personage that he sees, that Ezekiel is seeing, is because it describes one like a son of man, but it has this the figure is like glowing, and he has like a face like the sun. So often that's described as the pre-incarnate Christ. So perhaps that this, at least in Daniel, is a Christ-like figure, a messianic figure. And Christ-like figure clothed in linen garments is how it's the person is described in Ezekiel 9. And so here we have, I think it's likely that Daniel and Ezekiel, were familiar with, with each other. Certainly they're using similar ideas about the coming of the Messiah, because they were contemporaries. And of course, John's vision in the book of Revelation in chapter 1 describes the same thing. And we know for certain that is a vision of Jesus, right? Because it's talking about the one who was slain. Let's see. Let's look at Revelation 1 for some of the ideas there.
Among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest.
Yeah, there we go. So there's that picture of the one like a son of man, and of course this one it goes on to talk about his head and hair were like white as wool, white as snow, Revelation 1:14, and then it says his feet were like glowing bronze, his voice is like the sound of rushing waters. In verse 17, when I fell at his feet as though dead, he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one, and I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever, ever and ever." So, if the language of this picture is being described in the same way as Daniel was describing the person he saw, here we know it's Jesus, because Jesus is saying, "I'm the beginning and the end. I was the one who was dead, and now is alive." So that would mean that Daniel chapter 10 is describing a vision of Christ, but before his incarnation. So the pre-incarnate Christ. Some people claim that it's just a vision of God. Like from the Jewish perspective, they would say, this is God revealing himself to Daniel. But they often thought of it as a messianic prophecy. But of course, they don't want to connect it to Jesus. And Christianity, of course, has been able to do this because John uses the exact same language in Revelation to describe Jesus as Daniel did. Okay, well, what are some of the reasons why he's described this way? Because, there's symbolism behind the description. So the linen robe represents like purity, right, and righteousness, and that's actually what Jesus is going to give to people. It says in the book of Revelation, it says that the saints are the ones with the white robes, and they've cleansed them in the blood of the Lamb. Right now, if you wash a robe in blood, it's not going to be white. So it's symbolic. So the sacrificial blood of Jesus purifies people of their sin. So that's why the white robes represent forgiveness. And so here, it's not because this person needs to be forgiven, but just because he himself, it represents purity and righteousness. And the gold sash can represent, gold is valuable. So, the integrity, the value of this person's authority may be represented by that. And chrysolite, I think is...
That's the same as beryl.
Is that red? Beryl? It's yellow? Yeah, it's a kind of,
Chryso means gold.
yeah, chrysolite. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but if you looked it up online, you'd probably be able to see what color it is. And it represents an aspect of the of this divine person. Yeah, so chrysolite or beryl, which is, so the thing is that the Hebrew name is probably a name that we're not absolutely sure which semi-precious stone it is, and so we can only tell by context in other places in the Bible and stuff. So the book of Revelation actually talks about how the foundation of the New Jerusalem is going to be built on 12 semi-precious gems, and I think one of them is probably chrysolite, and so chrysolite is like a bluish green,
Or bright green.
bright green.
Bright green, it says here.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. Which is interesting to imagine this vision of a person his body is like this, like this bluish green rock, and his face is like lightning, and his eyes like flaming torches. I saw a really interesting. There's all kinds of theologians that are into science as well, and apparently, all of the minerals that are listed in the book of Revelation as the foundation of the new temple, or the New Jerusalem, that is, that they have a property about them that is that's unique, and I think it is. I'm not absolutely sure how it goes, but it's something like that the atoms line up in a way so that that these kinds of crystals have a property that's different than any other type of crystal, right? So there's some things that when you're reading the text, you might say, well, why didn't the author choose this mineral over this mineral? We might think that like diamonds are more precious than rubies or something like that. And when in fact, all of the minerals that are listed have a property, I think that, I don't know, I probably should have looked at this ahead of time because I can't remember what it is, but it's that's uniquely found in just those minerals. And so it's like of all the other minerals on Earth, the 12 that have this unique property are the only ones that are listed for the New Jerusalem. So I'll look it up and find out next time.
Yeah, I thought those stones were all the birthstones that we use today, because there's 12
No.
birthstones. That's what I thought.
No, they.
Mistaken.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of them are similar to birthstones, but they specifically have. In the Bible, whenever you have something that's listed like this, there's more symbolism behind it. So nothing's an accident. God chooses everything for a purpose, and sometimes we don't always know those purposes, but ultimately we can see that God is completely in control. God is a God of order and not of chaos, and so nothing is coincidence. And then that's one of the blessings of studying. It's like you may not know it, but as you study, you can find more and more depth to the meaning. Okay, well, I was talking about the symbolism of this divine person. So if his face is like lightning, lightning is is very, very bright, right? And so this picture of this pure being, because in the book of Exodus, when Moses asks God, I think it's chapter 34, he says, God, I want to see you, God, and he says, nobody can see me and live. My glory is so strong, so great that you couldn't handle it. And so, but God says, I will place my hand over the cleft in the rock, and after my glory has passed by, shall take my hand away, and you shall see the passing of my glory. So he can only see the backside of God. And that's the kind of thing here, is that this lightning represents that glory that is so brilliant. You can't look at the sun without losing your eyesight. And here it is telling us that this person's face is like the sun. Lightning is, I don't know if it's brighter than the sun. Usually it comes in a streak, so it's not like looking right into the sun. But then it talks about the eyes with flaming torches, and the arms like gleaming burnished bronze, and then the voice like the sound of a multitude. Here, sound of a multitude is, a sound that you can't reproduce by yourself, obviously, right? And there's a thunderous quality about, if you've ever been like in a stadium, I think there's an attraction to being at big events, because the roar of a crowd is just, it's like sound washes over you, and it's an amazing feeling. The cathedrals of our modern age are football stadiums and sports centers, right? I mean, think about it, like in the ancient world, they built these giant locations in order to celebrate the gods, and today we build some things that are even larger and grander, but they're usually just for sports. And so that just goes to show, if somebody, an archaeologist 1,000 years from now, looked back and looked around at our age, they would say, oh, those people sure love to worship in these stadiums, because they're all over, right? And you gather.
They worship the Rams, the Raiders, the
Yeah.
Packers,
Just like the ancient people used to worship animals as well. So it's almost like the sports teams are the names of the gods of the ancient world, right?
The Packers.
The Packers, yeah. Or the
Packers have nothing to do with the ancient world. Go on.
yeah, some of them don't have a connection to the ancient world, but okay. So in verse 7, somebody read that.
I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves.
Okay, so when God gives a vision to somebody, it doesn't mean that the vision is always understood. I mean, remember when Jesus was baptized, and it says that God spoke and said, "This is my son." And some people said they didn't hear any words. What did they hear?
Thunder.
Thunder, right. So the voice of God can sound like thunder to those, especially who don't believe. And then, but there's another story in the New Testament that this sounds familiar to, right? Who was the person who heard the voice of the Lord? That's right. Saul, before he was converted to Paul. And it's interesting, I normally used to say that he was converted, but because he was already Jewish and he believed in the coming of the Messiah, he wasn't really converted, he was transformed. His faith was transformed from like a very narrow faith, like I can only believe the Messiah has to be a king, to a true faith where he saw that Jesus was the suffering servant who was also the Messiah. Paul was the one who, on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9, when Jesus appeared to him and said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" He says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." So the other men with Saul didn't hear the voice. They thought it had thundered. And so here's another idea that just as Jesus spoke to Saul, maybe this is Jesus speaking to Daniel. Okay, verse 8.
So I was left alone and saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me. My radiant appearance was fearfully changed, and I retained no strength. Then I heard the sound of his words, and as I heard the sound of his words, I fell on my face in deep sleep with my face to the ground.
So there's an overwhelming character to being in the presence of divinity. So even angels, right? Angels induce fear in people. So, not saying this is an angel, but, as the pre-incarnate Christ, he felt helpless. His strength was gone. It tells us he turned pale. And all of these things are, representations of how sinful humanity, when faced in front of the holy God or holiness in general, will react, right? So if you were to see an angel, you'd probably fall on your knees as well. So it says that the people who were with him had left because they were fled in fear. But he doesn't flee. That shows that he knows that God is not going to hurt him. That God, he already had a vision of the Messiah earlier, and that was a vision where, the pre-incarnate Christ was ruling and was given authority. Okay, in verse 9, which we just read, it says, I heard him speaking, and I fell into a deep sleep with my face on the ground. So there's other places in the Bible when God is speaking, who fell asleep in the middle of this, and God put the person to sleep.
Moses. No, Abraham.
Abraham, right. Abraham, it says in Genesis 15, God told Abraham to make the sacrificial animals, split them in two parts, and then put them in a line. So this is the covenant ceremony. It's called a suzerain vassal covenant, where you have like an emperor, and then a vassal is like a lower king who is pledging allegiance to the king, right? So God is the suzerain or the emperor, but instead of Abraham meeting him in the middle of this the sacrificial event, it says that the Lord put him to sleep, and Abraham in Genesis 15 fell into a deep sleep, and then it says, then a fire pot appeared between the pieces, and so that shows that God, symbolized by the fire, was taking upon himself the responsibility of the covenant, the responsibility of both parties, right? So God's saying, I'll be your God, and you will be my people. So if Abraham or his descendants sinned, then they broke the covenant, and they no longer are the people of God. But because Abraham didn't appear at the ceremony, and only the fire appeared, God is saying, I'm going to take the responsibility for both persons. If I'm not faithful, then because what happens when you have the pieces of the sacrifice? It represents, if I break my word, then may I be killed like these animals were killed. It's called a self-maledictory oath. And so Abraham, of course, his descendants, they did break the covenant, so they deserve death, right? The wages of sin is death. But because God appeared between the pieces of the sacrifices, God is saying, I'm going to take the penalty of death upon myself to keep this covenant intact. So that's why God didn't allow Moses to do it. Abraham to appear. God is saying, I'm going to take the penalty of death upon myself. So, of course, the Messiah's job is to take our place, to keep the covenant intact so that we can be God's people in heaven forever. And, of course, even before heaven, that's true through faith.
I had a question.
Yeah.
There are a lot of ties in Daniel to Jesus, right?
Yes.
According to Christian teaching. What happens in the Jewish church? Don't they have the same?
So, yeah, for Judaism, this picture of this one appearing before Daniel is, to them, is obviously a divine figure, and they would say that it's pointing to the Messiah.
Oh.
So they actually do believe in messianic interpretation. It's just that they have a disagreement about who the Messiah is. So they say, yes, this is the Messiah,
Okay.
and we're still waiting for him.
Uh-huh.
Right, so they say Jesus didn't fulfill it. But then again, who was it that saw Jesus appearing with his face like lightning? It was only Peter, James, and John, right? Even the other disciples didn't see that. And then when Jesus, I I guess maybe that's the only time that Jesus showed his full glory. Well, after his resurrection, though, it tells us that, people didn't recognize him, like on the road to Emmaus. So perhaps, Jesus was in his post-resurrection body. He had a glorified body, so he was probably different. The same but different. So, maybe this is what this is describing, is that this glory is still human and yet somehow divine at the same time. Okay, well, so let's stop here, because in verse 10 we'll continue on with what this divine person does and tells him. And the rest of this chapter is short. We'll be able to finish chapter 10 next week.